In the shadows of corporate boardrooms where billion-dollar deals are made and broken with a handshake, there exists a woman whose name you'll never find in Forbes magazines or business headlines. She doesn't wear expensive suits or carry briefcases filled with contracts. Instead, she carries secrets that could topple governments and silence that could save lives. Her story begins not with ambition or greed, but with a single moment of courage that would forever change how dangerous information disappears from the world. Some call her a ghost. Others whisper she's a guardian angel for those who know too much. But the truth is far more extraordinary than any legend. This is the story of Elena Rodriguez, a woman who turned the art of making problems vanish into something that would challenge everything you think you know about power, corruption, and the price of doing what's right. What started as a favor for a desperate friend would spiral into a network so sophisticated that even those who hunt secrets for a living couldn't trace her footsteps. The whispers started in Silicon Valley, spread through Wall Street, and eventually reached the highest levels of government. They all spoke of the same thing, someone who could make the most dangerous information simply cease to exist, as if it never happened at all. But Elena Rodriguez was about to discover that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried, and some enemies too dangerous to outrun. Her story will make you question everything you believe about justice, loyalty, and the lengths one person will go to protect the innocent from those who would silence them forever. Elena Rodriguez never intended to become the person that powerful people feared most. On that rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle, she was simply a digital forensics specialist trying to grab coffee before her shift at the cybersecurity firm, where she'd worked for the past 8 years. The call that would change everything came at exactly 6:47 a.m. Interrupting her routine as she stood in line at her favorite coffee shop. "Elena, I need your help." The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, her former colleague and one of the few people she trusted completely. But something in his tone made her stomach clench with worry. Marcus never sounded scared, yet now his words carried an edge of panic that made her forget about her morning caffeine fix entirely. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping away from the line and moving toward a quieter corner of the bustling cafe. Around her, the typical Seattle crowd rushed through their morning routines, oblivious to the conversation that was about to set in motion events that would ripple through corporate boardrooms and government offices across the country. Marcus's story unfolded like a nightmare. He'd been working as a senior data analyst for Meridian Industries, a pharmaceutical company that had recently developed what they claimed was a revolutionary new drug for treating childhood leukemia. The clinical trials had been promising, the FDA approval seemed certain, and the company's stock had soared on the news. But 3 days ago, Marcus had discovered something that made his blood run cold. "The data's been falsified, Elena," he whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible above the morning traffic outside. "The drug doesn't just fail to work, it's actively harmful. Kids in the trial are getting sicker, but the reports are being altered to show improvement. They're going to kill children for profit." Elena felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She knew Marcus well enough to understand that he wouldn't make such accusations lightly. His reputation for thoroughness and accuracy was legendary in their field. If he said the data had been manipulated, then someone had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. "Have you gone to the authorities?" she asked, though something in her gut already knew the answer. "I tried," Marcus replied, and she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I went to my supervisor first, thinking maybe it was just a mistake in the database. He told me I was mistaken and suggested I take some time off. When I persisted, I was called into a meeting with the legal department. They made it very clear that my employment contract includes strict confidentiality clauses and that discussing proprietary research outside the company could result in both termination and criminal prosecution."
Elena's mind raced through the implications. Meridian Industries wasn't just any pharmaceutical company. They were one of the largest in the world, with annual revenues exceeding $50 billion.
They had teams of lawyers, lobbyists, and public relations specialists whose job was to protect the company's interests. Against that kind of institutional power, one whistleblower stood little chance. "What about the FDA? Surely they would investigate if you presented them with evidence." Marcus laughed bitterly. "I thought about that, but then I did some research. 3 FDA officials who have overseen drug approvals in the past 5 years now work for companies that have major contracts with Meridian. The regulatory capture is complete. Even if I could get someone to listen, the evidence would disappear long before any meaningful investigation could begin." As Elena listened to her friend's desperate situation, her mind began working on the technical aspects of the problem. Throughout her career in digital forensics, she had developed an expertise in data recovery and electronic evidence preservation. She had helped law enforcement agencies crack encryption, recover deleted files, and trace digital footprints that criminals thought they had erased forever. But this situation was different. This wasn't about finding evidence. It was about keeping it safe from people who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints. "Send me everything you have," she told Marcus. "Every file, every email, every piece of documentation. I need to see the full scope of what we're dealing with. Elena, you don't understand. These people are dangerous. After my meeting with Legal, I noticed cars following me home. My phone has been acting strange. Calls dropping, messages not sending. Yesterday I found evidence that someone had been in my apartment while I was at work. Nothing was stolen, but things were moved just enough to let me know they'd been there." The coffee shop around Elena seemed to fade into the background as the reality of the situation crystallized. Marcus wasn't just talking about corporate malfeasance or regulatory corruption. He was describing a conspiracy that included surveillance, intimidation, and possibly worse. The people behind this had too much money and power at stake to let one concerned employee destroy their plans. "All the more reason to act quickly," Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her veins. "They're trying to scare you into silence, which means they know the evidence is damaging. If we can get it into the right hands before they can suppress it completely, we might be able to save those kids."
But even as she spoke the words, Elena knew that the right hands were exactly the problem. Every traditional channel for reporting corporate wrongdoing seemed to be compromised.
The media would demand verification that could take months, giving Meridian time to destroy evidence and discredit Marcus. Regulatory agencies were staffed by people with financial ties to the industry. And law enforcement would need probable cause that would be nearly impossible to establish without cooperation from the very institutions that were part of the cover-up. Marcus transmitted the files using an encrypted connection that Elena had set up years ago for exactly these kinds of sensitive communications. As the data flowed across secure channels to her personal servers, Elena began to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. The evidence was overwhelming and damning, but it was also the kind of information that would make them both targets of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and possibly violence to protect their secrets. The clinical trial data showed a clear pattern of manipulation that had been carefully designed to hide the drug's dangerous side effects. Children who had suffered severe complications or died during the trial were simply removed from the official reports. Their cases were classified as unrelated adverse events and filed separately, making it appear as though the drug was not only safe but remarkably effective. The real data showed a mortality rate that was 3 times higher than existing treatments, along with side effects that would cause lifelong health problems for survivors. But the medical data was only part of the story. Marcus had also uncovered emails and financial records that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Payments had been made to research institutions to ensure favorable study designs. Regulatory officials had been offered lucrative consulting contracts that would begin after their government service ended. Media companies with major pharmaceutical advertising contracts had been given advance notice of the drug's approval to ensure positive coverage. As Elena analyzed the evidence, she realized that traditional whistleblower protections would be useless in this situation. The people involved had too much to lose and too much power to wield. Marcus would be destroyed professionally and possibly physically long before any official investigation could provide him with protection. The children who would be harmed by the drug would suffer, while lawyers and bureaucrats engaged in procedural delays that could last for years. That's when Elena began to formulate a plan that would eventually evolve into something far more significant than either of them could have imagined. Instead of trying to work within systems that had been compromised, she would create her own system. One that could preserve and disseminate evidence in ways that couldn't be traced, blocked, or suppressed by even the most powerful adversaries. The plan began with the simple recognition that in the digital age, information wanted to be free. But making information truly free required more than just posting it online or sending it to journalists. It required understanding the vulnerabilities of every system that powerful people use to control information flow, and then exploiting those vulnerabilities in ways that couldn't be predicted or prevented. Elena's background in digital forensics had taught her that every electronic device left traces, every communication network had weaknesses, and every attempt to suppress information created new pathways for that information to spread. The key was to think like water, finding every crack, every weak point, every path of least resistance, and flowing through them faster than anyone could build new barriers. Over the next 72 hours, Elena worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She barely slept, lived on coffee and energy bars, and turned her apartment into a high-tech command center that would have impressed government intelligence agencies. Her plan was ambitious and dangerous, but it was also elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to convince any single authority to act on Marcus's evidence, she would simultaneously present the evidence to dozens of different parties across multiple jurisdictions and media outlets. But she wouldn't do it in a way that could be traced back to either of them. Instead, she would create digital personas that were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but couldn't be connected to any real individuals. The evidence would be packaged differently for each recipient, with specific details highlighted that would be most relevant to their particular area of expertise or authority. Medical journals would receive analyses focused on the clinical implications. Law enforcement agencies would get summaries emphasizing potential criminal violations. Financial regulators would see evidence of securities fraud. International authorities would be provided with documentation of violations that fell under their jurisdiction. But Elena's masterstroke was the coordination of the releases. Every recipient would receive their package at exactly the same time, making it impossible for Meridian's damage control teams to focus their efforts effectively. By the time the company realized what was happening, the story would already be spreading through multiple channels simultaneously, creating a cascade effect that would be impossible to contain. The technical execution required skills that Elena had developed over years of working in digital forensics, but it also demanded creativity and psychological insight that went far beyond her professional training. She had to understand not just how information systems worked, but how people worked, what would motivate different recipients to act quickly, how to present evidence in ways that would seem credible and urgent, and how to anticipate and counter the inevitable attempts at suppression and disinformation. As Elena put the finishing touches on her plan, she couldn't have known that she was creating the blueprint for something that would eventually grow far beyond this single case.
The method she was developing to protect Marcus and the children who would be harmed by Meridian's drug would prove to be applicable to a wide range of situations where powerful people tried to suppress dangerous information. But on that Thursday morning, as she prepared to execute the most audacious information operation of her life, Elena Rodriguez was simply a woman trying to do the right thing in a world where doing the right thing had become increasingly dangerous.
She had no idea that within months, people across the country would be whispering about someone who could make their most dangerous problems disappear before anyone could see them coming. The first indication that Elena's plan had worked came at 4:23 a.m. on Friday morning, when her secure communication system lit up with an encrypted message from Marcus. The text was brief but electric with excitement. "It's everywhere. They can't stop it." Elena had been awake for the past 6 hours, monitoring news feeds and regulatory websites across multiple time zones, watching as her carefully orchestrated information campaign unfolded exactly as she had planned. The simultaneous release of evidence to dozens of recipients had created a perfect storm that Meridian Industries was completely unprepared to handle. The first break had come from an investigative journalist at the Washington Post who had received a package of clinical trial data at exactly midnight Eastern Time. By 1 a.m., a preliminary story was posted online questioning the safety data for Meridian's new leukemia drug. The story was careful and measured, presenting the allegations as unverified claims that required further investigation, but it included enough specific details to establish credibility. Within 2 hours, similar stories began appearing in medical journals and trade publications across the globe. The British Medical Journal published an editorial calling for an immediate review of the clinical trial data. The European Medicines Agency issued a statement saying they were reviewing concerning allegations about the drug's approval process. In Japan, regulators announced they were suspending their own approval proceedings pending clarification from their American counterparts. But the real devastation came from the financial markets. Elena had timed her releases to ensure that the story would break during trading hours in multiple markets around the world. As news of the safety concerns spread, Meridian's stock price began to collapse. By the time markets opened in New York, the company had already lost more than $3 billion in market value, and the selling pressure was intensifying with each new revelation. Elena watched the corporate response unfold with the same analytical precision she brought to digital forensics investigations.
Meridian's initial strategy was exactly what she had predicted: deny everything, attack the credibility of the sources, and use their legal resources to intimidate anyone who continued to pursue the story. But this approach, which had worked effectively against individual whistleblowers in the past, was completely inadequate against a coordinated information campaign that struck from multiple directions simultaneously. The company's first press release, issued at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, dismissed the allegations as baseless attacks by short sellers and disgruntled former employees. They threatened legal action against media outlets that published false and defamatory information, and they announced that they stood behind their clinical trial data completely. But Elena had anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. Within minutes of Meridian's press release,
Additional evidence began appearing online that directly contradicted the company's denials. Internal emails that showed executives discussing the need to manage unfavorable trial results. Financial records documenting payments to consulting firms that specialized in regulatory affairs. Communications between company officials and FDA reviewers that suggested inappropriate coordination during the approval process. Each new revelation was timed to appear just as the company's damage control efforts gained momentum, creating a whipsaw effect that left Meridian's crisis management team constantly reacting to new crises before they could properly address existing ones.
Elena had learned from years of studying information warfare that the key to overwhelming sophisticated adversaries was not to hit them with one massive attack, but to subject them to a series of smaller attacks that came too quickly and from too many directions to counter effectively. The cascading effect that Elena had hoped for began to manifest in ways that exceeded even her optimistic projections.
As more media outlets picked up the story, new sources began coming forward with additional evidence of corruption and misconduct. Former Meridian employees who had been intimidated into silence suddenly found courage in numbers. Regulatory officials who had been pressured to expedite the drug's approval began speaking to investigators on condition of anonymity. Medical professionals who had participated in the clinical trials started reviewing their own data more carefully and discovering discrepancies they had previously overlooked. Parents of children who had participated in the trials and experienced adverse events began connecting with each other through social media, sharing stories that painted a picture of systematic deception and cover-up.
Elena realized that she had inadvertently created something more powerful than an information operation. She had catalyzed a movement.
The evidence she had released had provided a focal point around which people who had been isolated and vulnerable could unite. Instead of facing Meridian's intimidation tactics alone, they now had the protection that came from being part of a larger community of people demanding accountability.
But Elena also understood that Meridian wouldn't simply accept defeat. Companies with $50 billion in annual revenue didn't survive by giving up when faced with adverse publicity. They survived by fighting back with every resource at their disposal, and those resources were considerable. The counterattack began on Friday afternoon, when Elena noticed that several of the websites hosting evidence about the Meridian case had suddenly become inaccessible. When she investigated further, she discovered that the sites hadn't simply crashed. They had been hit by distributed denial-of-service attacks that were sophisticated enough to suggest professional cybercriminal organizations rather than amateur hackers. Simultaneously, social media platforms began removing posts about the Meridian case, citing violations of community standards and terms of service. Users who had shared evidence or commentary found their accounts temporarily suspended for spreading unverified information. The removals were too coordinated and too rapid to be the result of normal content moderation processes. Elena recognized the tactics immediately. Meridian had hired a crisis management firm that specialized in digital reputation management, and they were using the same techniques that authoritarian governments employed to suppress dissent. But where government censorship was often crude and obvious, corporate information warfare was subtle and deniable. Posts weren't removed for being critical of Meridian. They were removed for technical violations that could be attributed to automated systems rather than human decisions. The realization that she was now engaged in active information warfare with a multinational corporation should have been terrifying, but instead Elena felt a surge of excitement that surprised her. For years, she had used her technical skills to help law enforcement agencies investigate crimes that had already been committed. Now, for the first time, she was using those same skills to prevent a crime that was still in progress. But preventing Meridian from harming children was only part of the challenge. Elena also had to protect Marcus and herself from retaliation that was becoming increasingly aggressive. Marcus reported that the surveillance around his apartment had intensified dramatically. But unmarked vehicles were now stationed outside his building around the clock, and he had noticed the same faces appearing repeatedly in different locations throughout his daily routine. More concerning was the evidence that both of their digital communications were being intercepted and analyzed. Elena's secure systems were sophisticated enough to prevent casual eavesdropping, but she began detecting probing attacks that suggested professional intelligence capabilities. Someone with access to military-grade cyber warfare tools was trying to penetrate her defenses. Elena made the decision that would prove to be the most important of her career. Instead of retreating in the face of escalating threats, she decided to go on the offensive. If Meridian wanted to fight an information war, she would give them one they couldn't win. The plan she developed over the next 48 hours was audacious in scope and revolutionary in execution. Rather than simply defending the evidence she had already released, Elena would create a system that could continuously generate and disseminate new evidence,
faster than any corporation could suppress it. She would turn information warfare into information flooding, overwhelming Meridian's defensive capabilities through sheer volume and unpredictability. The technical architecture she designed was based on principles of distributed computing and peer-to-peer networking. Instead of hosting evidence on servers that could be attacked or shut down, she would distribute it across thousands of individual computers whose owners weren't even aware they were participating in the operation. The evidence would be broken into small fragments and spread across multiple networks, making it impossible to suppress without shutting down large portions of the internet itself. But the real innovation was in the automated systems Elena created to generate new attacks based on Meridian's defensive responses. Every attempt to suppress information would trigger the release of additional information from different sources. Every legal threat would be met with evidence of new legal violations. Every public relations campaign would be countered by revelations that undermined the company's credibility. Elena called her creation the Hydra Protocol, after the mythical creature that grew 2 heads for every one that was cut off. The more aggressively Meridian fought the information campaign, the stronger and more widespread it would become. The first full test of the Hydra Protocol came on Monday morning, when Meridian's legal team filed lawsuits against 17 media outlets, demanding retractions and damages for what they called a coordinated campaign of defamation. The company's strategy was to make continued coverage of the story too legally risky and expensive for most news organizations to pursue. Within hours of the lawsuits being filed, Elena's automated systems detected the legal actions and triggered predetermined responses. New evidence began appearing on hundreds of websites simultaneously, including internal Meridian documents that showed the company's legal team had previously used identical tactics to suppress other whistleblowers. The documents revealed a pattern of litigation abuse that stretched back more than a decade, including cases where the company had knowingly filed false claims to intimidate legitimate critics.
The revelation that Meridian's legal threats were themselves part of a systematic pattern of misconduct transformed the narrative from a story about one dangerous drug to a story about corporate abuse of the legal system. Legal scholars began writing articles about the case as an example of how large corporations weaponize litigation to silence legitimate criticism. Bar associations in several states announced they were reviewing whether Meridian's litigation tactics violated professional ethics rules. More devastating was the evidence that Meridian had hired private investigators to gather compromising information about journalists, regulators, and potential whistleblowers. The documents showed that the company maintained detailed files on hundreds of individuals, including personal information that had been obtained through illegal surveillance and hacking operations. Private investigation revelations triggered law enforcement investigations in multiple jurisdictions. The FBI announced they were opening a criminal investigation into potential violations of federal wiretapping laws. State attorneys general began coordinating a multi-state investigation into the company's business practices. International law enforcement agencies started examining whether Meridian's activities in their countries violated local privacy and surveillance laws. Elena watched the cascade of investigations unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation. She had successfully transformed a single whistleblower complaint into a global scandal that was destroying one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. But she had also created something that was beyond her ability to control completely. The Hydra Protocol was working exactly as designed, but its success was generating attention that Elena hadn't fully anticipated. Intelligence agencies around the world had begun studying the case to understand how a single individual with technical expertise could cause such massive disruption to a multinational corporation. The techniques Elena had developed were being analyzed and reverse-engineered by people who might use them for purposes she would never support. More immediately concerning was the evidence that other actors were beginning to piggyback on her operation. Hackers with unknown motivations were using the chaos surrounding Meridian to conduct their own attacks on the company's systems. Foreign governments were amplifying the story for their own geopolitical purposes. Competitors were using the scandal as cover for their own corporate espionage operations. Elena realized that she had inadvertently created a new form of asymmetric warfare that could be used by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge and motivation. The tools and techniques she had developed to protect children from a dangerous drug could be adapted to attack any target for any reason. She had opened Pandora's box, and there was no way to close it again. But even as Elena grappled with the broader implications of what she had created, the immediate crisis continued to unfold. Marcus reported that the surveillance around him had suddenly disappeared completely, which was somehow more ominous than the obvious intimidation tactics that had preceded it. When people with unlimited resources stopped using crude methods, it usually meant they were preparing to use subtle ones. Elena's own situation was becoming increasingly precarious as well. Her apartment had been broken into twice in the past week, Though nothing had been stolen or obviously disturbed, her financial accounts were being subjected to routine audits that were clearly anything but routine. Government agencies that had previously shown no interest in her work were suddenly asking detailed questions about her consulting activities and client relationships.
The knock on Elena's door came at precisely 3:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Meridian Industries had officially announced the suspension of their leukemia drug pending additional safety reviews. Elena had been expecting some form of contact for days, ever since her monitoring systems had detected sophisticated attempts to trace the origin of the information campaign that had brought down one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies.
She opened the door to find a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed despite the early hour, holding credentials that identified her as Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Cybercrime Division. But Elena's trained eye immediately noticed details that suggested this wasn't a typical law enforcement visit.
Agent Martinez was alone, which violated standard FBI protocols for field contacts. Her credentials were authentic but showed assignment to a division that Elena knew specialized in counterintelligence rather than cybercrime.
"Miss Rodriguez, we need to talk," Martinez said, her voice carrying a tone of urgency that seemed genuine. "But not here.
There are things you need to know about what you've started, and this conversation requires absolute privacy." Elena's first instinct was to decline the meeting and contact a lawyer, but something in Martinez's expression suggested that this wasn't a criminal investigation.
Instead, it seemed like a warning, and Elena had learned to trust her instincts when it came to reading people's motivations. An hour later, they sat in an all-night diner 30 miles outside Seattle, surrounded by the kind of anonymous industrial sprawl that made surveillance difficult and casual eavesdropping unlikely.
Martinez had chosen the location carefully, Elena realized, suggesting a level of operational awareness that exceeded what most FBI agents would possess. "Before we begin," Martinez said, placing her phone in Elena's in a small metal box that Elena recognized as a Faraday cage designed to block electronic signals, "I need you to understand that this conversation is not happening officially."
"I'm not here as an FBI agent, and nothing we discuss can be used in any legal proceeding."
Elena studied the woman across from her, noting the signs of stress and exhaustion that suggested Martinez hadn't been sleeping well.
"If you're not here as an FBI agent, then why are you here? Because 3 weeks ago you accidentally stumbled into the middle of something much larger than a pharmaceutical company covering up dangerous clinical trials. The Meridian operation was a proof of concept for capabilities that several very dangerous organizations have been trying to develop for years. When you demonstrated that a single individual with the right technical skills could bring down a multinational corporation, you changed the strategic balance in ways that have implications far beyond anything you intended." Martinez reached into her briefcase and removed a tablet computer that she placed on the table between them.
The screen showed a map of the world with dozens of red dots scattered across different countries. Each of these dots represents an incident in the past 3 weeks where your techniques have been replicated by other actors. Most of them are relatively benign. Activists exposing corporate wrongdoing, journalists revealing government corruption, whistleblowers providing evidence of criminal activity. But some of them aren't benign at all. Martinez touched one of the red dots and the screen expanded to show details of an incident in Eastern Europe. This is where a foreign intelligence service used modified versions of your Hydra protocol to destabilize elections in 3 different countries. They flooded social media with false evidence of electoral fraud, created cascading disinformation campaigns that overwhelmed fact-checking efforts, and triggered civil unrest that required military intervention to control. She touched another dot, this one in Asia. Here, a terrorist organization used your distributed evidence hosting techniques to recruit new members and coordinate attacks. Because the information was spread across thousands of compromised computers, law enforcement agencies couldn't shut down their communications network without obtaining legal authorization in dozens of different jurisdictions. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as the implications of what Martinez was telling her became clear. The tools she had created to protect children from dangerous drugs were being weaponized by people whose goals were fundamentally destructive. "You have to understand," Elena said, her voice defensive. "I never intended for any of this to happen. I was just trying to save kids from a drug that would have killed them."
"I know," Martinez replied, her tone sympathetic but firm. "Your intentions were admirable and the outcome of the Meridian case was unquestionably positive.
The drug has been withdrawn from the market, the company is facing criminal charges, and dozens of children who would have been harmed are now safe. But good intentions don't change the fact that you've created a weapon, and that weapon is now being used by people whose intentions are anything but good." Martinez touched another section of the tablet. and the screen showed a series of news headlines from around the world. Financial markets in chaos as coordinated information attacks triggered panic selling. Democratic governments struggling to respond to disinformation campaigns that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Criminal organizations using sophisticated technical methods to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts. The question now, Martinez continued, is what we do about it. The traditional approach would be to arrest you, seize your equipment, and try to suppress knowledge of your techniques through classified legal proceedings. But that approach won't work, because the information is already out there. Too many people have reverse-engineered your methods, and too many copies of your tools exist in too many places. Elena's mind raced through the options, and none of them seemed attractive.
So what are you proposing? Partnership, Martinez said simply. You created these tools, which means you understand them better than anyone else. You know their capabilities and their limitations. Most importantly, you know how to counter them.
The proposal that Martinez outlined was unlike anything Elena had ever heard of from a government agency. Instead of trying to suppress the tools Elena had created, they wanted her to help develop countermeasures that could be used to defend against malicious applications of her techniques. She would work with a small team of specialists to study how her methods were being used by hostile actors and develop strategies to neutralize those applications without harming legitimate uses. It would be completely unofficial. Martinez explained. No paperwork, no formal employment, no legal obligations beyond what you choose to accept voluntarily. You would have complete autonomy over your work and absolute veto power over how it's used. But you would also have access to intelligence about how your techniques are being weaponized and resources to develop solutions that no individual working alone could possibly create. Elena spent the next hour asking detailed questions about the proposal, testing Martinez's knowledge and commitment to understand whether this was a genuine offer or an elaborate trap. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Martinez was exactly who she claimed to be, a government official who was genuinely concerned about the implications of Elena's work and genuinely committed to finding solutions that would preserve the beneficial applications while mitigating the harmful ones. But Elena also understood that accepting the partnership would fundamentally change her life in ways that went far beyond the professional implications. Once she became involved with government intelligence operations, even unofficially, she would be crossing a line that she could never uncross. She would have access to information and capabilities that would make her a target for hostile foreign governments, criminal organizations, and domestic extremist groups. The decision was made easier by a phone call that Elena received as she drove home from the meeting with Martinez. Marcus's voice was strained with panic as he described what had happened to him over the past 24 hours. They took everything, Elena, he said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. My computers, my backup drives, every piece of evidence I had collected about Meridian. But it wasn't the FBI or any other law enforcement agency. The people who broke into my apartment weren't wearing uniforms or badges. They were professionals, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. Marcus went on to describe how the intruders had used sophisticated electronic devices to defeat his security systems, how they had worked with military precision to locate and remove specific items while leaving everything else undisturbed, and how they had somehow known the location of hidden backup drives that he had never told anyone about. The worst part, Marcus continued, is that they left a message. Not written or verbal, but implied. They arranged some of my personal belongings in a way that made it clear they knew everything about my daily routines, my relationships, my vulnerabilities. It was a demonstration of power designed to show me that they could reach me anywhere, anytime, and that there was nowhere I could hide if they decided I was a threat. Elena realized that Marcus had become collateral damage in a conflict that was much larger than either of them had understood. The people who had targeted him weren't necessarily connected to Meridian Industries, which was now a broken company facing criminal prosecution. Instead, they were likely representatives of other organizations that wanted to understand and potentially weaponize the techniques Elena had developed. The implications were chilling. If hostile actors were willing to burglarize and intimidate Marcus to gain access to Elena's methods, they would certainly be willing to target Elena herself more directly. Her choice wasn't really between accepting Martinez's partnership offer or continuing to work independently. Her choice was between accepting help from people who shared her fundamental values or facing threats from people who didn't share any values at all.
Elena called Martinez that evening and agreed to the partnership, but with conditions that reflected her understanding of the dangers involved.
She would maintain her independence and her right to refuse any assignment that conflicted with her ethical principles. She would have complete control over her own security arrangements and living situation, and she would retain the right to withdraw from the partnership at any time if she became uncomfortable with its direction.
The facility where Elena began working a week later bore no resemblance to any government office she had ever seen. Located in what appeared to be a converted warehouse in an industrial district outside Washington, D.C., it was staffed by a diverse group of individuals whose backgrounds spanned academia, private industry, and government service. Some were former intelligence operatives who had become disillusioned with traditional bureaucratic approaches to emerging threats.
Others were academics who had studied information warfare from theoretical perspectives and wanted to apply their knowledge to practical problems. Elena's first assignment was to analyze how her techniques had been modified and deployed by the Eastern European Intelligence Service that Martinez had described during their initial meeting.
The work required her to reverse engineer tools that were based on her original designs but had been adapted for purposes that were fundamentally different from her own goals. What she discovered was both fascinating and horrifying.
The foreign operatives had understood the technical aspects of her methods perfectly, but they had completely missed the ethical framework that had guided her original development process. Where Elena had designed her tools to amplify truth and expose wrongdoing, the Foreign Intelligence Service had created versions designed to amplify lies and create wrongdoing.
The modifications were subtle but significant.
Where Elena's original Hydra protocol had included built-in verification systems to ensure that only authentic evidence was disseminated, the weaponized version had systems designed to create false evidence that was convincing enough to fool casual analysis. Where her tools had been designed to target powerful organizations that were abusing their authority, the modified versions were designed to target democratic institutions and civil society organizations that were trying to hold powerful actors accountable.
Elena spent weeks studying the weaponized applications of her work, and each new discovery reinforced her conviction that she had made the right choice in accepting Martinez's partnership offer. The people who were adapting her techniques for malicious purposes were sophisticated and well-resourced, but they were also constrained by their own malicious intentions.
Because their goals were fundamentally destructive, they couldn't take advantage of the collaborative and crowdsourcing elements that had made Elena's original operation so effective. This insight led to Elena's first major breakthrough in developing countermeasures against malicious applications of her techniques.
She realized that the same network effects that had amplified her campaign against Meridian could be used to identify and neutralize disinformation campaigns. By creating tools that allowed legitimate researchers and journalists to collaborate in real time to verify information and trace its sources, she could build defensive systems that would be more effective than any traditional top-down approach to combating false information.
The defensive tools Elena developed were based on principles of distributed verification and collective intelligence. Instead of relying on central authorities to determine what information was true or false, her systems empowered networks of independent actors to evaluate evidence according to transparent criteria and share their findings with others who were working on related problems. But Elena's most important contribution to the partnership went beyond technical innovation.
Her experience with the Meridian case had taught her that the most effective information operations were those that aligned with people's existing values and motivations, rather than trying to manipulate or deceive them. The foreign intelligence services that were weaponizing her techniques were failing because they fundamentally misunderstood how information moved through social networks and how people made decisions about what to believe and how to act. Elena's insight was that truth had inherent advantages over falsehood in information warfare, but only if those advantages were properly leveraged. Truth was more resilient under scrutiny, more likely to be supported by multiple independent sources, and more consistent with people's direct experiences of the world.
But these advantages only mattered if systems were designed to reward accuracy and punish deception. The framework Elena developed for distinguishing between beneficial and harmful applications of her techniques became the foundation for a new approach to information security that was adopted by organizations around the world.
Instead of trying to control information flow through censorship and suppression, her approach focused on improving information quality through transparency and accountability. 6 months after joining the unofficial partnership with Agent Martinez, Elena Rodriguez found herself standing in a secure conference room beneath the streets of Washington, D.C., facing a crisis that would test everything she had learned about information warfare and its consequences.
The room's occupants represented the highest levels of the American intelligence community, but the emergency that had brought them together transcended national boundaries and traditional security frameworks. The briefing began with satellite imagery that showed unusual activity at financial centers around the world.
Markets that should have been operating normally were instead experiencing coordinated disruptions that seemed to follow patterns Elena recognized from her own work. Trading algorithms were being manipulated by false information that appeared authentic enough to fool automated verification systems.
Currency values were fluctuating wildly based on rumors that seemed to originate from dozens of different sources simultaneously but showed signs of centralized coordination.
"We're looking at the most sophisticated economic warfare operation in history," explained Director James Harrison,
whose official title disguised his role as coordinator of cross-agency responses to emerging technological threats. Someone has weaponized information distribution techniques to attack the fundamental trust relationships that make global commerce possible. Elena studied the data streams flowing across multiple screens around the conference room, noting patterns that were both familiar and deeply concerning. The attack methods showed clear derivation from her original techniques, but they had been refined and scaled in ways that suggested extensive resources and professional expertise.
More troubling was the evidence that the attacks were being coordinated across multiple time zones and target areas, indicating a level of operational sophistication that exceeded most government capabilities. The immediate damage is already in the billions, Harrison continued, but the long-term implications could be civilization-threatening.
If people lose confidence in the basic information systems that underlie economic exchange, we could be looking at a collapse of global commerce that would make the Great Depression look like a minor recession. Agent Martinez, who had become Elena's primary liaison with the intelligence community, added details that made the situation even more alarming.
We've identified attack vectors targeting critical infrastructure systems, healthcare networks, and emergency response communications. This isn't just about economic disruption. Whoever is behind this is trying to undermine the basic functioning of modern society.
Elena felt a familiar chill as she recognized the scope and ambition of what they were facing. The Meridian operation had taught her that information could be weaponized in ways that traditional security frameworks couldn't address, but she had assumed that most applications would be limited in scale and scope. What Harrison and Martinez were describing suggested that someone had taken her techniques and scaled them to a level where they could threaten the stability of entire nations. "Do we have any indication of who's behind this?" Elena asked, though she suspected the answer would be complicated. Harrison exchanged glances with Martinez before responding. "That's where things get really concerning. The attack signatures show elements consistent with at least 3 different foreign intelligence services, 2 major criminal organizations, and several terrorist groups. But the coordination between these normally hostile entities suggests that either someone is controlling all of them, or they've found a way to collaborate that we don't understand."
Elena spent the next several hours reviewing intelligence data that painted a picture of a threat unlike anything she had encountered before.
The attackers weren't just using modified versions of her techniques. They had developed entirely new capabilities that built on her foundational work, but exceeded it in ways that seemed almost impossible. Most disturbing was the evidence that the attackers had solved problems that Elena herself had never been able to address completely. Her original tools had been limited by the need to preserve accuracy and authenticity, which created bottlenecks that prevented truly massive operations. But the current attacks showed no such constraints, suggesting that the attackers had developed methods for generating convincing false information at industrial scale. The technical analysis revealed systems that could create thousands of fake identities with detailed digital histories, generate false documentation that could fool expert examination, and coordinate activities across networks of compromised computers that numbered in the millions. The resources required for such operations suggested state-level backing, but the coordination across multiple hostile states suggested something beyond traditional nation-state capabilities. Elena's breakthrough came when she realized that she was approaching the problem from the wrong angle. Instead of trying to understand who was behind the attacks or how they had developed such sophisticated capabilities, she began focusing on why they had chosen to attack economic and infrastructure targets rather than pursuing traditional intelligence or military objectives. "They're not trying to steal information or gain strategic advantage," she explained to the assembled intelligence officials. "They're trying to create chaos for its own sake. The economic attacks aren't designed to benefit any particular nation or organization. They're designed to reduce confidence in the systems that enable international cooperation and peaceful resolution of conflicts." This insight led Elena to a conclusion that was even more disturbing than foreign intelligence involvement. They're using information warfare as a tool of accelerated social decay. Agent Martinez leaned forward in her chair. "What does that mean for our response options?" "It means that traditional counterintelligence approaches won't work," Elena replied. "We can't negotiate with someone whose goal is the destruction of the systems that make negotiation possible. We can't deter someone who wants to trigger the kind of chaos that makes deterrence irrelevant. And we can't defend against attacks that are designed to undermine the social trust that makes defensive cooperation possible." The room fell silent as the implications of Elena's analysis sank in. If she was correct, they were facing an adversary whose goals were fundamentally incompatible with the continued existence of modern civilization. Traditional security responses assumed that adversaries wanted to gain power or influence within existing systems. But an adversary that wanted to destroy those systems entirely
would require fundamentally different countermeasures.
Elena spent the next week developing what she called the Immune System Protocol, a framework for defending against information warfare that was modeled on biological immune responses rather than traditional military strategies. Instead of trying to identify and eliminate specific threats, the protocol focused on strengthening the overall resilience of information networks so they could adapt to new threats automatically. The biological analogy was deliberate and precise.
Just as biological immune systems worked by distinguishing between healthy cells that should be protected and foreign invaders that should be eliminated, Elena's protocol worked by distinguishing between information that contributed to social stability and cooperation and information that was designed to undermine those qualities. But implementing the protocol required Elena to confront ethical questions that she had been avoiding since the beginning of her involvement with the intelligence community.
Creating systems that could automatically distinguish between beneficial and harmful information meant making value judgments about what kinds of social outcomes were desirable. It meant developing tools that could potentially be used for censorship and social control by future governments that might not share her democratic values. Elena's solution was to build democratic accountability directly into the technical architecture of the system. Instead of relying on government officials or intelligence agencies to determine what information should be suppressed, the protocol used distributed decision-making processes that involved thousands of independent participants from different countries and cultural backgrounds.
The system worked by creating economic incentives for accurate information and economic penalties for false information, but the determination of accuracy was made through competitive processes that rewarded participants for correctly identifying misinformation before it could spread widely. The result was a kind of information marketplace where truth had natural advantages, but those advantages had to be earned through transparent verification processes.
Elena's first test of the immune system protocol came when the economic warfare attacks suddenly shifted to target the 2024 American presidential election.
False information about voting procedures, candidate backgrounds, and election security began flooding social media platforms at a rate that overwhelmed traditional fact-checking capabilities. The attacks were coordinated across multiple platforms simultaneously and designed to create confusion and conflict regardless of which candidate ultimately won. Traditional election security measures proved inadequate against attacks that targeted voter perceptions rather than voting infrastructure. Law enforcement agencies could protect physical polling places and secure electronic voting systems, but they couldn't protect the information environment that shaped how voters understood the choices they were making.
Elena's protocol provided the first effective defense against the election-focused information warfare. By creating incentive structures that rewarded rapid identification of false information and penalties for spreading misinformation, the system enabled crowds of motivated volunteers to fact-check and counter disinformation faster than automated systems could generate it. The results exceeded Elena's most optimistic projections. Within weeks of deployment, the quality of information circulating on major social media platforms improved dramatically. False information was still being generated and distributed, but it was being identified and countered so quickly that it rarely had time to influence public opinion significantly. More importantly, the system began generating positive feedback loops that strengthened democratic discourse more broadly. As people became accustomed to participating in collaborative fact-checking processes, they became more skilled at evaluating information independently. As the economic rewards for accuracy increased, more people became motivated to develop expertise in subjects that were important for democratic decision-making. Elena watched the 2024 election unfold with a sense of cautious optimism. The information attacks continued throughout the campaign period, but they were being countered effectively by networks of citizens who had been empowered with tools for collaborative verification and fact-checking. The election result itself was less important to Elena than the evidence that democratic systems could adapt and strengthen themselves in response to new forms of warfare. But Elena's optimism was tempered by her understanding that the forces she was fighting against would continue to adapt and evolve. The same techniques that had proven effective against economic warfare and election interference could be modified to target other vulnerabilities in democratic systems. The arms race between information attackers and defenders was just beginning, and there was no guarantee that the defensive side would always maintain its current advantages. More concerning was the evidence that Elena's own success was creating new categories of threats. Authoritarian governments around the world had begun studying her techniques not to defend against information warfare, but to improve their own capabilities for controlling domestic information environments. Democratic governments were facing pressure to adopt more aggressive information control measures in response to foreign threats, potentially undermining the openness and transparency that made democratic systems worth defending. Elena realized that she had stumbled into a fundamental paradox of information warfare in democratic societies.
The same tools and techniques that were necessary for defending democracy against external threats could also be used to undermine democracy from within. The immune system she had developed to protect open societies from hostile information attacks could potentially be repurposed to create closed societies that were immune to beneficial information as well.
The solution Elena developed was characteristically elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to control who could use information warfare techniques, she focused on making the techniques themselves inherently biased toward transparency and accountability.
By building democratic values directly into the technical architecture of information systems, she created tools that became less effective the more they were used for authoritarian purposes. The breakthrough came from Elena's recognition that information warfare was ultimately about trust relationships between people, rather than technical capabilities of computers.
The most sophisticated disinformation campaign would fail if people had reliable ways to verify information independently. Conversely, even crude propaganda could be effective if people had no choice but to rely on centralized authorities for information.
Elena's final innovation was the development of what she called trust networks, distributed systems that allowed people to build and maintain trust relationships across traditional boundaries of geography, culture, and ideology. Instead of relying on institutional authorities to determine what information was reliable, people could rely on networks of individuals whose judgment they had learned to trust through direct experience.
The trust networks were designed to be resistant to both centralized control and coordinated manipulation. Because trust relationships were based on individual interactions rather than algorithmic recommendations, they couldn't be gamed by automated systems or manipulated by bad actors who didn't have authentic relationships with network participants. But the most important feature of the trust networks was their tendency to promote accurate information over false information through natural selection pressures.
People who consistently shared accurate information gained trust within their networks, while people who shared false information gradually lost trust and influence. The result was a self-organizing system that promoted truthfulness without requiring any central authority to define what truth meant.
As Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from a single case of pharmaceutical fraud to the development of new frameworks for information warfare and democratic defense, she realized that her greatest contribution hadn't been technical innovation or strategic insight. Instead, it had been the recognition that in an age of information abundance, the most important strategic resource was trustworthiness rather than firepower or wealth.
The whispers that had begun with rumors about Elena's ability to make dangerous information disappear had evolved into something far more significant. People across the globe were beginning to understand that in a world where information could be weaponized by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge, the most important defense was a citizenry that was empowered to distinguish between truth and falsehood independently. Elena Rodriguez had become much more than a woman who could make problems disappear. She had become the architect of a new kind of immune system for democratic societies, one that could adapt and evolve to meet emerging threats while preserving the openness and accountability that made democratic life possible.
2 years after the 2024 election, Elena Rodriguez stood in a small apartment overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching news reports that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier.
The trust networks she had developed were now being used by over 300 million people across 67 countries, creating the first truly global system for collaborative verification of information that transcended traditional boundaries of nation, culture, and ideology. But the success of her defensive innovations had triggered evolutionary pressures that were producing increasingly sophisticated attacks.
The latest threat briefing from Agent Martinez, delivered via encrypted communication to Elena's secure location in Big Sur, California, described information warfare capabilities that seemed to push the boundaries of what was technically possible. "They're calling it reality synthesis," Martinez explained during their monthly video conference, her image transmitted through channels that were protected by Elena's most advanced security protocols.
Instead of trying to manipulate existing information or create false documents, they're generating entire synthetic realities that are internally consistent and virtually impossible to distinguish from authentic experiences. Elena studied the intelligence reports that Martinez was sharing on her screen, noting technical details that suggested a level of artificial intelligence capability that exceeded what was publicly known to exist. The attackers were no longer simply creating false text or images. They were creating false memories, synthetic relationships, and fabricated historical events that could be experienced as real by their targets. The implications go far beyond traditional propaganda or disinformation, Martinez continued.
"We're seeing evidence that hostile actors can now create personalized false realities for specific individuals, targeting their particular psychological vulnerabilities and social relationships. Instead of trying to convince large populations to believe false information, they're convincing key individuals to doubt their own perceptions and memories." Elena felt a familiar chill as she contemplated the implications of what Martinez was describing.
Information warfare had evolved from a threat to democratic decision-making to a threat to human consciousness itself. If people could no longer trust their own experiences and memories, the entire foundation of rational discourse and democratic participation would become meaningless. The technical analysis revealed attack methods that were both breathtakingly sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Using advances in artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and neuroscience, the attackers could create immersive experiences that were designed to reshape their target's understanding of reality at the most fundamental level.
The attacks weren't trying to convince people to change their opinions. They were trying to change people's memories of the experiences that had formed those opinions. We've identified at least 17 high-level government officials in allied nations who appear to have been targeted by these reality synthesis attacks, Martinez explained.
In each case, the individual began making decisions that were completely inconsistent with their previously established values and priorities, but they seemed genuinely convinced that their new positions were based on authentic experiences and careful reasoning. Elena realized that she was facing a new category of threat that couldn't be addressed through the techniques she had previously developed.
The trust networks and verification systems she had created were designed to distinguish between true and false information, but they were useless against attacks that targeted the cognitive processes people use to interpret information in the first place.
The solution Elena began developing represented the most ambitious project of her career. Instead of trying to defend against specific attacks on information systems, she would create tools that could defend against attacks on human consciousness itself. She called the project Cognitive Sovereignty, a framework for helping individuals maintain autonomous control over their own perception and memory, even in environments where those processes were being actively manipulated. The theoretical foundation for cognitive sovereignty came from Elena's collaboration with neuroscientists and psychologists who had been studying how human consciousness could be protected against technological manipulation.
The key insight was that while external technologies could influence perception and memory, they couldn't completely override the human capacity for self-reflection and critical thinking if that capacity was properly developed and supported. Elena's approach was based on the recognition that consciousness was fundamentally social rather than individual. People's understanding of reality was shaped not just by their direct experiences, but by their interactions with other people who could provide alternative perspectives and independent verification of events. By strengthening these social dimensions of consciousness, individuals could become more resistant to manipulation that targeted their individual psychological vulnerabilities. The technical implementation of cognitive sovereignty required Elena to develop tools that were unlike anything she had created before. Instead of focusing on information systems, she had to focus on the human beings who use those systems. Instead of trying to automate verification processes, she had to empower people to verify their own experiences through collaborative dialogue with others.
The breakthrough came when Elena realized that the same network effects that had made her information warfare techniques so powerful could be used to create cognitive resistance against those same techniques. By connecting people in networks that were specifically designed to support independent thinking and memory verification, she could create collective intelligence that was more resistant to manipulation than any individual consciousness could be.
The first test of cognitive sovereignty came when Elena herself became a target of reality synthesis attacks. She began experiencing memories of conversations and events that seemed authentic but didn't match her written records, or the recollections of people who had been present.
The attacks were subtle and persistent, designed to make her question her own judgment and withdraw from the work that had made her a threat to hostile actors. But Elena's own tools proved effective against the attacks targeting her. The networks of trusted collaborators she had built over years of working on information warfare provided independent verification of her experiences and helped her distinguish between authentic memories and synthetic ones. More importantly, the collaborative verification processes helped her understand how the attacks worked, providing insights that enabled her to develop more effective defenses.
Elena's resistance to the reality synthesis attacks targeting her became a proof of concept that attracted attention from democratic governments around the world. Political leaders who had been targeted by similar attacks began seeking Elena's help in developing their own cognitive defenses.
Intelligence agencies that had been struggling to protect their personnel from psychological manipulation began incorporating Elena's techniques into their training programs. But Elena's most important contribution was her recognition that cognitive sovereignty couldn't be achieved through technology alone. It required cultural and educational changes that would prepare entire populations to resist manipulation of their consciousness. She began developing curricula for schools and universities that would teach young people how to maintain cognitive autonomy in environments where their perceptions were being actively manipulated. The educational program Elena created was based on the understanding that cognitive autonomy was like physical fitness. It required regular practice and exercise to maintain. Students learned to recognize the signs of psychological manipulation, to verify their memories through multiple independent sources, and to collaborate with others in ways that supported independent thinking rather than conformity. More importantly, the curriculum taught students to view diversity of perspective as a cognitive security resource rather than a source of conflict. By learning to engage constructively with people who had different experiences and viewpoints, students developed the kind of mental flexibility that was necessary to resist attacks designed to lock them into narrow and manipulable worldviews. The results of Elena's educational initiatives exceeded even her optimistic projections. Young people who had been trained in cognitive sovereignty techniques proved remarkably resistant to manipulation attempts that had been effective against previous generations. More importantly, they began developing their own innovations that enhanced cognitive autonomy in ways that Elena hadn't anticipated. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of cognitive commons, shared spaces where people could collaboratively verify experiences and memories in ways that were resistant to both individual delusion and collective manipulation. These spaces operated according to principles that Elena had developed, but they were implemented and governed by the communities that used them, rather than by any central authority. The cognitive commons represented a new form of democratic institution that was specifically designed for the information age. Instead of relying on traditional representatives to make decisions on behalf of constituencies, the commons enabled direct participation in collaborative reasoning processes that could address complex problems more effectively than traditional voting or deliberation. Elena watched the spread of cognitive commons around the world, with a mixture of pride and trepidation. The tools she had created were being used to strengthen democratic institutions and protect human autonomy in ways that exceeded her original vision. But she also understood that the same tools could potentially be adapted for authoritarian purposes if they fell into the wrong hands. The solution Elena developed was characteristically elegant. Instead of trying to control who could use cognitive sovereignty techniques, she made the techniques themselves inherently resistant to authoritarian applications. The collaborative reasoning processes that were essential to cognitive autonomy couldn't function effectively in environments where people weren't free to express dissenting views and challenge established authorities. This insight led to Elena's final major innovation, the development of freedom metrics, quantitative measures of cognitive autonomy that could be used to evaluate the health of democratic institutions and identify emerging threats to human freedom.
The metrics were based on the understanding that cognitive sovereignty was measurable through observable patterns of reasoning, memory verification, and collaborative decision-making. The freedom metrics proved to be powerful tools for early warning about authoritarian threats.
As governments or organizations began restricting cognitive autonomy, the metrics would detect the changes long before they became obvious through traditional political indicators. This early warning capability enabled democratic societies to respond to emerging threats before they became entrenched. Elena's work on cognitive sovereignty ultimately transformed her from someone who fought individual information warfare attacks to someone who had created permanent infrastructure for protecting human consciousness against technological manipulation. The networks, tools, and institutions she had developed were now being maintained and improved by millions of people around the world who had adopted cognitive sovereignty as a fundamental principle of democratic life. But perhaps Elena's most important legacy was her demonstration that technological threats to human freedom could be defeated by technologies that empowered human collaboration and critical thinking. The same digital networks that enabled mass manipulation could also enable mass resistance to manipulation, if they were designed according to principles that prioritized human autonomy over centralized control. As Elena approached her 50th birthday, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from a single case of pharmaceutical fraud to the development of new frameworks for protecting human consciousness in the digital age. The whispers that had once spoken of a woman who could make dangerous information disappear had evolved into something far more significant. Recognition that in an age of artificial intelligence and virtual reality, the most important human skill was the ability to think independently while collaborating with others. Elena Rodriguez had become more than a guardian of dangerous secrets or an architect of information warfare defenses.
She had become a pioneer of cognitive liberation, showing humanity how to maintain its autonomy and dignity in the face of technologies that threaten to reduce human beings to programmable objects. The network she had created would continue to evolve and adapt long after her own work was finished, providing tools and frameworks that future generations could use to face threats she couldn't yet imagine.
But the principles she had established, transparency, accountability,
collaborative verification, and respect for human cognitive autonomy would remain relevant as long as human beings valued truth and freedom over comfort and control. Elena's story had begun with a simple recognition that powerful people would always try to suppress information that threatened their interests. It ended with the understanding that in a world where information could be manufactured and reality could be synthesized, the most important form of resistance was the cultivation of human capabilities for independent thought and collaborative reasoning. She had started as a woman who could make problems disappear.
She had become something far more valuable, a woman who could help people learn to solve problems together, even when those problems seemed impossible to solve alone. The whispers would continue, but now they spoke of something more hopeful than mere technical capability. They spoke of human potential fulfilled through cooperation, wisdom gained through shared struggle, and freedom preserved through the courage to think independently while caring deeply about the common good. In the end, Elena Rodriguez's greatest achievement wasn't any particular technology or technique she had developed. It was her demonstration that ordinary people, working together with proper tools and principles, could preserve their humanity and their democracy, even against threats that seemed overwhelming and insurmountable. She had shown that the future of human freedom didn't depend on the benevolence of powerful institutions or the wisdom of brilliant leaders. It depended on the distributed intelligence and collaborative courage of people who refused to surrender their capacity to think for themselves and care for each other. They whispered danger. She made it disappear before anyone saw.